Hello there, Mr. Wisconsin Wine Guy. I'm back with another Saturday of the tours of local wineries and wine regions. Hey, I almost got off to a late start today. Oh man, the time just went by so fast. It's a beautiful day out, and I'm just enjoying myself completely. So, today's show is going to be very interesting. As you can tell, here's a little hint for you. Look at the bottle that's sitting in front of me. There's a hint to give you an idea of what today's show is going to be about. Let's see if I can get this open. So I'm drinking on Fanesca Porto Bin 27. So this is what's considered as a ruby style port. Now, if that's not giving you a hint as to what today's show is going to be about, then I don't know what to tell you. Let me give this a taste, and then I'll give you more information. Wow, that just hit the spot. Can't wait to get my cheese plate together and enjoy the show with you. So today we're going to be taking a tour of Portugal and discovering different styles, how port is made, and including what grapes ports are made from. So stand by and enjoy the show. And as always, enjoy the stories and enjoy the wine. And I'll see you after the show. Bye. Let me get this set up here.
In the world of wine, there is an ancient tradition for opening a bottle so old, the cork has become too fragile to be easily removed. Heated tongs are applied to the neck, followed by ice or a damp cloth, and voila! Called tonging, this custom is most closely linked to one kind of wine, port. Fortified with brandy, it's sweet, strong, and savory, with an incredible ability to age.
Some wines are ready to drink as soon as you buy them. Others are better after 3 or 5 years of aging. And then there's another wine that tradition has one generation buying it for the next. At least that's what I was told when I first started to learn about wine. I'm Michael Fagan. In this episode, we're going to discover one of the world's most famous wines, port.
Port, like many wines and spirits, is named for the city from which it is shipped. Oporto, or Porto as the locals call it, is both beautiful and ancient, with a history intrinsically linked to its most famous product. Today it is the second largest city in Portugal, playing a major role in the country's economy. The port shippers' warehouses, or lodges, reside to this day on the south side of the Douro River, called Vila Nova de Gaia. Many of these companies date back to the 17th century and are named for their British founders. The port trade is an industry that covets its traditions, and nowhere is it more evident than in this building, Factory House. Membership here is so exclusive, it's only extended to principals in the port trade who are of British descent. Rupert Symington, whose family's been in the port business for 4 generations, invited us to the club's private weekly meeting, the Wednesday lunch.
The British merchants about 200-300 years ago set up trade associations around the world, and they were called factories. And this, I think, is the last surviving example of a factory house anywhere in the world. I am one of about 25 members. There's a tradition, each member puts up 10 to 15 cases of the house's most recent wine. So we do have a pretty good library of wines going back probably over 100 years. Those wines do get served up very occasionally at dinners.
Tell me a little bit about the Wednesday lunch. What happens at the lunch?
Wednesday lunch really is members of the trade bring their colleagues from other firms, customers, the odd journalist, And then at the end of lunch, we have a charming ceremony where we actually guess the vintage port. The treasurer selects a vintage port and then puts it on the table without telling anybody what it is, and then we all have to guess what it is, which is, tremendous fun, as you can imagine.
After all these years, the factory house still represents the British influence on the port industry today. Where did it all begin?
One of the oldest port houses is Taylor, Fladgate and Yeatman, known simply as Taylor's. Established in 1692, Taylor's is run today by descendants of the Yeatman and Fladgate families, one of whom is Hewish Bower, the company's unofficial historian.
Before the middle of the 17th century, the British used to drink large quantities of wine from the old kingdom of Aquitaine, therefore Bordeaux, Bergerac, etc., in the southwest corner of France. And then Britain and France had one of the endless misunderstandings, and therefore the French forbade all trade between mainland Europe and the British Isles. So suddenly there was the most appalling thirst in the British Isles. And luckily for us, for instance, our founder had been sailing down here. He was in the wool business, so he actually knew the wine was being produced down here. Initially, the wine that these British entrepreneurs took back to England with them was a not very strong, still dry table wine.
The trouble was there that the wine had an extra day on the ocean before it got back to Britain, and it didn't travel too well. So they had the idea of adding brandy. So a lot of the world's famous fortified wines like sherry, port, Madeira, all originated that way. And I think the British acquired a taste for this rather strong, rich wine from Portugal, and the merchants started to actually settle in Oporto and build these warehouses.
While British wine merchants have dominated the port business from its inception, there are many Portuguese companies that also have long, rich histories.
The city of Porto is actually where the story of port ends. To find out where it begins, we have to move further east up the Douro River. That's where the grapes are grown.
And the easiest way to get there is by train. The Douro Valley is the oldest demarcated wine region in the world. In 1757, the Marquis of Pombal laid out the boundaries of the port wine region with granite pillars.
Parents are quick to protect.
Raid!
Just like Raid, Ant, and Roach.
But the Douro's history goes back much farther than that. The Romans, whose ancient structures can still be found in vineyards throughout the valley, first planted grapes here over 2,000 years ago. Today, the region's inhospitable conditions are masked by a lush growth of almonds, olives, and grapes, and it's hard to believe that even they grow here. Vineyards in the Douro are called Quintas, and our first stop was Bom Retiro. This Quinta is owned by Ramos Pinto, a company founded in 1890 by Adriano Ramos Pinto. We spoke with his great-grandson, João Nicolas de Almeida, about the formidable task of growing grapes in the Douro.
All these mountains, it's a rock. And then we have to break this rock and make soil. And then only on the fifth year we can make port. So we have to wait that the roots goes to the mother rock again. And fortunately, the leaves of the schist are in horizontal sense, and the roots get in the fissures of the schist and go very deep. That's why the vineyard can resist of all these very complicated conditions, because there is in the leaves of the schist a regular supply of water for the vineyard.
This is Miquel Roquet. 4 generations of his family have owned and run Quinta de Crasto, a quinta with roots reaching as far back as 1615. Miquel also knows a thing or two about the Douro.
So you have the vertical plantings here, which works fine here because it's very steep, but you don't lose a lot of land. While in some places where it's really, really steep, the only way for you to grow the wine is basically with terraces. It's surprising how they did that about 250 years ago, because you see a lot of pre-phylloxera walls everywhere, and that's the way they were growing wine 200 years ago. And at the time, there was no machinery, so everything has to be done handmade. Usually, you have many different grape varieties and so on. The new terraces, we tend to plant it by grape variety.
There are over 80 native grape varieties in the Douro, but since 1981, 6 varieties have been chosen as the best for port wine.
The best one is Touriga Nacional, is our noble variety. Touriga Nacional is this vineyard, this leaf. Touriga Nacional produce very low quantity.
Early September. After a long, bumpy ride deep into the Douro, we arrived at Ramos Pintos' Quinta de Alva Mora, just in time for the first harvest of the season. This quinta is like an oasis of green surrounded by mountains of rock.
Welcome to the Douro. It's hilly, it's hot, and yet they still manage to grow some of the finest grapes in the world.
The steepness of the vineyards makes mechanization impossible, so all the work must be done by hand. And it's hard work under a scorching sun. It was 45 degrees Celsius that day. Many producers told us how increasingly difficult it is to get people to do the work.
Like anywhere else, people don't want to work the traditional, agriculture. They don't want to necessarily live in places where they don't have color TV or, cinemas. And it's harder and harder to find people to work the agricultural side of the port trade.
And the work doesn't stop here. The grapes still have to be crushed. In Portugal, just like in ancient Rome, grapes are still crushed by feet in stone vats called lagars.
Some people think it's folklore or something for the tourists, but in fact it's still the best way to extract the maximum quality from the skin without spoiling the skin.
Treading starts at sundown and continues well past midnight. It's like a military march. And as you can see, they'll let just about anybody do it, as long as you wash your feet. Usually, after a few hours of marching, music is brought in and the dancing begins. But not in our lagar. They tell me it's good for your skin, though. Unfortunately, there are just not enough people to crush all port wine grapes by foot. Another technique is auto-vinification. Here, the carbon dioxide released naturally during fermentation is used to crush the grapes, somewhat like a percolator. A third method that uses robotic feet to simulate foot treading has just recently been developed as well.
Basically, the wines are tread until fermentation starts, the natural process of fermentation. So there's no artificial yeast. It's just a 100% natural process. So basically, with the release of alcohol, the baume, what you call, I think, bricks, will come down. So the more alcohol is released, the lower will be the baume. And it comes a time that you will stop the fermentation. And the way to do that, basically, is to add fortified brandy, which is 77% alcohol brandy. And right there, when you add the brandy to the must, or to the port juice, or the grape juice, basically the fermentation will stop because all the bacteria, everything will die.
The wine is then stored at the Quinta until the following spring when it's shipped to Porto. For hundreds of years, they used boats called barcos robelos to float the wine down the Douro. This was a dangerous journey that saw both precious cargo and lives lost to the river. Nowadays, it's done by tanker truck. Not as romantic, but much safer.
It's 120 kilometers up the Douro River where port is born. But it's across the river from Oporto and Villanova de Gaia where it actually takes its first steps.
The winemaker must now decide on the style of port for the new wine. And there are plenty of options. The essential difference between all port styles is the vessel in which it is aged, either casks or bottles, and the length of time it spends there. Let's start with Ruby Port. Sandeman, founded in 1790 by George Sandeman, is famous the world over for port and sherry. João Graça told us all about Ruby Port.
We age it in big vats like that one because the big vats avoid the oxidation. They have from 20 to 80,000 liters. And the wine keeps the young characteristics, the fresh fruit aromas.
White port is made essentially the same as Ruby Port, except it uses white grapes. It's the only style of port that does.
We produce white ports predominantly, in my particular opinion, for aperitifs before the meal. In the summer, I like to make it into a long drink in a highball glass, 6 lumps of ice, let us say. Fill up the glass half with dry white port. I would also put a leaf of mint or basil, and then add tonic or soda water for the rest.
The next major style of port is Tawny.
Tawny ports have long been known as the port shipper's port. What the port shippers drink at home tends to be Tawnies. And it's only relatively recently that what we call the aged Tawnies, the 10, 20, 30, 40-year-old, have been sold in commercial quantities.
If an age is specified on a Tawny label, it represents the average age of the wines in that blend. These wines are aged in barrels unique to the port trade, called pipes.
In the port trade, we really only use seasoned barrels. What's important about the wood is not that sort of resinous, new wood quality. It's the fact that it's a nice inert vessel with these little pores to help the wine breathe. So we take a wine that's probably this very rich purpley ruby color when it's first in barrel. Then over time, it goes into a lovely amber, golden hue, and it takes on a sort of nutty, dry characteristic, very different from the maturation in bottle. So unlike vintage port, which hasn't seen any air since it was first bottled, whatever it was, 10, 15 years ago, Tawny port has seen air all its life. So when you pull that cork, it really will be stable in your cupboard for, 3, 4, 5 weeks or more. I mean, it's an amazingly, solid and stable wine.
There is a vintage style of Tawny port as well, called Colheita. For this, we went to Newport, a company with Dutch origins founded in 1842. It is now run by Dirk Newport, a 5th-generation owner and winemaker.
Tell me a little bit about Colheita port.
Colheita port is a vintage Tawny, and it's a port that we have to age at least 7 years in wood. Usually people think that Colheitas and Tawnies in general have to be drunk within the first 2 years after bottling. It might be true for most of the ports. In our case, I don't think it is. Actually, we say the other way around. We think that our Tawnies taste better after they've been a couple of years in bottle.
Another style of port is late bottle vintage, or LBV. Nicholas Heath from Fonseca cleared up a few questions we had about this style.
That's right. What's the significance for late bottle vintage?
Yes, it's a curious name, late bottle vintage. What does it mean? Does it mean bottled at 11 o'clock at night or bottled too late? In fact, what it means is bottled later than vintage port. Vintage port, as you know, is bottled after 2 years in the wood, and it continues to age in the bottle. Late bottle vintage stays in the wood for between 4 and 6 years, so it has more wood age than vintage port does.
Now, I guess one of the other advantages of late bottle vintage is you're getting some of the characteristics of a vintage port without having the expense of purchasing and waiting for something to age.
Yes, that's right. Late bottle vintage is excellent value for money, but one of the big advantages is that it doesn't need any special handling. You don't have to decant the wine. You don't have to worry about how long you're going to cellar it, because it doesn't need any cellaring. You can just pour it straight from the bottle, enjoy the glass, put the cork back in the bottle, and have another glass 10 days later, and the wine will be in perfect condition.
And that brings us to vintage port. Delicious, expensive, and port's most famous style.
Port wine was born as a Tawny, and then vintage was English creation for this style. And the vintage is declared when it's a good year, very good year. It's from the best part of our vineyards, and the vintage is from just 1 year as a date in the label, and age 2 years in barrels, and is bottled on the second year.
In order to be called vintage port, the producer must first send a sample of their wine to the IVP. This is the regulatory body that controls the quality of all port wine. They have the final say on whether or not a single wine or an entire year will be declared vintage.
When they propose a wine as a vintage, they try to say that this is my best wine. And sometimes we refuse, and it's not easier to do a vintage wine.
So this is all vintage port.
That's right. All vintage port aging in the bottle.
Now, how long would you keep it in the cellar before releasing it?
That would depend on what kind of vintage port it was. If it was a new vintage, a new declaration, most of the wine would be released en primeur, rather in the same way as the great growths of Bordeaux would be sold. If you're talking about a single estate or single Quinta vintage port, it would remain in the cellar for 12 to 15 years before being released onto the market.
One of the things with vintage port, as I understand, was tradition is you would buy it for the next generation. How did that start?
I think that started because vintage port is probably one of the world's most long-lasting wines. It's probably the only wine which will remain in good condition for the child's entire life. So when the wine is coming up to drinking age, the child will be coming up to drinking age as well, and it'll be possible for the child to enjoy the wine as it matures from there on until he or she is in her 80s or 90s. These have to be wines of massive structure and concentration, great staying power, wines with the ability to reveal layers of aroma over many, many years or decades.
Once that bottle is open, can I drink it over a period of time?
No, that's one thing you can't do with vintage port. Vintage port, you should drink the whole bottle the day you draw the cork. Now, this is not generally a problem in a Porto, but I can understand there may be some people who may not wish to drink a whole bottle of port in an evening. During the aging process, during this time in the bottle, the wine will throw a crust or sediment, and the wine must be separated from this sediment in the bottle by being poured into a decanter before it's drunk.
So it's a good idea probably before decanting just to stand a bottle up for about a couple of hours. That's sufficient. Take a plain corkscrew. You don't have to have anything very fancy. You don't need any port tongues or anything like that. Just tease the cork out and look through the stream of liquid.
That way you'll pick up if there's any sediment.
Exactly, and you can often see the sediment on the side of the decanter as it goes through. So I'm stopping there just as I see the first flecks of sediment. Normally you'll leave about a ½ inch of wine in the bottle. It's a small sacrifice to pay for to get a nice.
Now, can you use that for anything, or does
this
that
is
just...
great for a reduction sauce, deglazing a pan. Some people even have it on toast, I believe, but not a great fan of it. But it's a nice, it's still the solid concentrate of the. So I'm going to pour a couple of glasses.
When you're looking at a port glass, what should you look for in a port glass?
I like a glass not too wide. You want to be able to, this is modeled very closely on the on the sort of ISO tasting glass. So you've got something to trap the aromas. Port is a bottle matured ports have a very delicate nose, and you don't want too open a glass, so you tend to lose some of those nice fruit characteristics.
With so many varieties of port, it seems there's one for every occasion. And the experts were happy to give us lots of ideas about when to drink the different styles and what to enjoy them with.
You can drink ruby port with chocolate mousse and strawberries.
I prefer port with cheese. Cheese and port, sometimes it's my favorite dinner. Just cheese and port, port and cheese.
With some cheese or even chocolate with my colleagues. LBV, it's the best I propose.
If you took a 20-year-old Tawny where you've got caramel, nuts, a little bit of spice, that goes extremely well when served chilled with foie gras.
Steak au poivre or pepper steak with some young vintage port. It really works very well.
In my opinion, the classic Tawny, the 20 years, we can drink at the end of the meal with a cake with a caramel or crème brûlée.
I love, either vintage port or old Tawny port with cheeses. Some of my favorite cheeses are these really nice, stinky, unpasteurized French cheeses like, vintage port with a nice reblochon or something is absolutely delicious. Or a Tawny port with one of those more spicier cheeses like a cheddar or a Stilton.
Stilton is always the classic. What is it about Stilton?
Well, I think it's the fact that it's a powerful, rich cheese, which sets off the wine very well. But I think it's also tradition. It's because it's English.
Although port-style wines are produced in Australia, South Africa, California, even Ontario, true port comes from Portugal.
It's a long journey that port travels, and at destinations around the world, people are discovering its delicious flavors in many styles.
If you have comments on this program or ideas for future episodes, write to us. Our email address is discover@lcbo.com.
Until next time.
Should I go around and twist the bottle every now and again?
No, it's not champagne. You should leave it exactly where it is.
I'm making wines today, which probably my grandson will sell.
But I think the wonderful thing about port is it's unique in the world. There really isn't anything like it. And it does, I think of any wine in the world, including all table wines, it probably gives you more flavor per glass than just about any other wine in the world.
Wow, that was fantastic. I mean, port is one of those wines that is oftentimes overlooked. You see a port in the store, you think, I don't want that, it's going to be too sweet. But people don't realize that there's so much to discover in the bottle of the port wine. And I simply just completely enjoy it. And enjoy the different styles, enjoy the different ages. I recall a time of doing a port wine tasting. This is back in a time when I had a wine shop. And I didn't let the guests know that this was going to be a port tasting. Because as soon as you mentioned port, just like once upon a time, if you were to say sparkling wine or champagne, people would frown. So I did not tell them in the invitation that this was going to be a port tasting. It was going to be a phenomenal port tasting at that. But, so the invitation went out. It was going to be a port style tasting. We had up to 40 guests at the tasting. So it was pretty big. So it was pretty nice and a lot of fun. But what I did was, instead of having traditional things that people think, chocolate, blue cheese, or some desserts with port, I went total savory. So the dishes we had were Middle Eastern style dishes, nice spices, flavor, just all kind of savory, flavorful dishes, for people to try. And as the guests entered, the first thing they received, again, remember, they did not know what this was, but the first thing they received when they entered the door was a white port cocktail. I thought that was so cool when they mentioned that in the video, because it was similar to that, the white port cocktail that I created, but this is more like a mojito. So a white port mojito. Fantastic. You have to try that. So it went on, and the guests had a chance to enjoy it, to get a complete range and understanding of port. We did exactly what you saw in the video, the different styles of port. You know, and probably the most interesting port we had was, I believe it's called Cinto, Centurion or something like that, but meaning it was a 100-year-old port. So we did Tawny port. We did 10, 20, 40, 50, and 100-year-old port, in addition to the rubies, late bottle finishes, and white port, etc. So I'm encouraging you to go out and explore the world of port, explore the different styles, get some friends together, and just have a grand old time. I have my snack tray here with white cheddar, dried fruit, and chocolate. I have my port. I have the sun. I'm going to enjoy the rest of my day, and I wish you to enjoy the rest of your day. And as always, let your palate be the guide when selecting your next wine. And I'll see you next time. Bye now. White cheddar and